Good morning, everyone. And today we're going to be reading and talking about The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. Bear in mind, all of Edgar Allan Poe's works are generally dark and creepy and disturbing. They are meant to be. They are part of the American dark, romantic, and gothic movements, so expect them to be weird, but appropriate for the Halloween season if that's the time you're listening to this. But before we start, let's start with something a little more lighthearted. You've heard of Elf on a Shelf. Now get ready for Zoo Sonic Caboose. But moving on. The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. The Red Death has long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal, or so hideous. Blood was its avatar, and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, with dissolution. Scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, for the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow man. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. So Poe describes a fictional disease called the Red Death, but probably inspired by the Black Death or bubonic plague of medieval Europe. Huge deal back then, killed tons of people, made it into a lot of literature and art in that time, left a lasting impression on all of humanity, really. But the Red Death is a fictional analog for that. Let's see. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve, or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, and there was wine. All of these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. So Prospero here is a nobleman, wealthy, owns a castle that was apparently once an abbey or monastery at one time, but he's super rich, and has turned the abbey into a castle of partying and pleasure. Lots of food and drink, entertainers of every kind. He invites all his rich friends and then shuts and bolts the gates, fixes them fast so that no one can enter, no one can leave until this darn Red Death thing is done and over with. They're going to try and quarantine and hold out. We'll see how that goes. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th months of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. So a party, a ball with masks. But first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand. so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, and in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its adornments and tapestries, and here the panes were of purple. A third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, but falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes were of scarlet, a deep blood color. Now in no one of these 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro, or dependent from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in such the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep, and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of the hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions. And there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedated passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. But then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. So note here, weird thing, the only thing that interrupts their partying is discomfort about the red and black room, which its coloration probably reminds them of the Red Death, and the striking of the clock at each hour, which is also housed in the red and black room, makes them afraid for a moment. They pause, they grow silent and pale. And that's weird. You don't normally do that with clocks, but what can a clock represent, especially in a room that looks like the Red Death? Could represent that your time is limited, your time is flying by, your days are numbered, hours numbered, time marches on, death comes for us all, things like that. Something about mortality and fearing one's mortality coming for them, like the seconds of clock passing away, days on the calendar passing away. So each time the clock chimes, by the hour, they momentarily consider their mortality again and are afraid. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the seven chambers upon occasion of this great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madmen fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. So apparently Prospero has some weird decoration tastes. To and fro in the seven chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet. And then for a moment all is still, and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand still, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live, and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays of the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes. And the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears, who indulged in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. So more and more they shun the red and black room, because more and more they're struggling not to think about the Red Death. It's like, don't think about the Red Death. Don't think about it. Don't think about it. But the harder they try not to think about it, the more it troubles their thoughts, and everything sets them off. The color of the room, the strike of the clock, anything can set off their worries that they're trying to suppress. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirlingly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, and as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened perhaps that more of thought crept, with more of time, into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus too it happened perhaps that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sank into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz, a murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, and then finally of terror, horror, and disgust. So after the stroke of midnight, or at the stroke of midnight, a new person appears in a place that's completely sealed and quarantined. A new costumed figure. And we're not told what he looks like yet, other than his appearance immediately strikes horror and disgust in everyone that looks at him. Considering what everyone's afraid of right now, theorize, infer what he must look like to bring that up in them. Also note that the hour after midnight is often popular in stories with superstitions or things going on as, the witching hour, the time when spooky things happen, the hour after midnight. So, interestingly chosen time of day. In an assembly of phantasms, such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such a sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, that's a biblical allusion, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless, which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger, neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that a close scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around, but the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. So what's so appalling about his appearance, his costume? While everyone else is costumed in fun things, I assume, fun masks, fun outfits, he's wearing the raiments that you put on a corpse when you're ready to bury them, burial clothes. And his mask is made to look like the face of a dead man. And it's all sprinkled with drops of blood, like the dead victim of the Red Death, of this plague here. So he is the living embodiment of the plague of the Red Death in this outfit. And everyone is in horror and disgust. The very thing they've tried to keep out, the very thing they're trying not to think about, so keeping out of here and out of the manor is somehow now within. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon the spectral image, which with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste, but in the next, his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." So Prospero was deeply angered that anyone would dare bring up the Red Death in their party to avoid the Red Death. Deeply disturbed by this. It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero. As he uttered these words, they rang through the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there. Hold on a moment. Not laughing at the story. There was something else going on in the room. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now with deliberate and stately step made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumption of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpeded, He passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green to the orange, through this again to the white and even to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterward fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror to find the grave cerements and corpse-like mask, which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangled form. So, Prospero chases the Red Death figure to the black and red room. The Red Death figure stands right in front of the clock, as if to say, I'm connected to this somehow. The march of time and I, the coming of death. And Prospero goes to stab him with a knife, but instead he falls dead. The Red Death just stands there. And then the mob of other partiers try to attack the figure dressed like the Red Death. They pull off the gown, they pull off the mask, and there's nothing underneath. Just a mask and grave burial robes, no person. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay, and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Not a happy ending, to be sure, but then again, Poe rarely has any of those in any of his works, so bear that in mind. Notice how the overarching theme here seems to be that despite their best efforts, no matter what you do, death comes for us all. They locked themselves up in a monastery, partied far away from the plague, and still it came for them, personified in as a person. So that's interesting. Personification is a figurative device you should always be aware of. It's when something non-human is given human traits. Could be an animal, plant, an abstract concept like death. All of that's personification. Now, a subset of that is anthropomorphism, which is human traits to animals specifically, but here we're dealing with personification in a broader sense. Red Death as a person. Either way, interesting story, one of my favorites by Poe. Next time, we'll look at The Raven in the next video. So go ahead and answer your study guide questions, and see you next time. Take care.